Welcome back to Legal Principles of Surveying 2014. I am Chris Rouse, your instructor. This is from East Central Community College in Decatur, Mississippi, and we're talking about Chapter 3 in Brown's Boundary Control and Legal Principles. Ownership, transfer, and description of real property. Now, I've split this up into two parts because the videos can be kind of long, and so I made two videos for this one, part 1 of 2. And we're going to start by talking about real property and the concept of ownership of real property. Now, the concept of ownership, transfer, and description of real property is not subject to simple categorization, definition, or understanding. Even for the surveyor, real property is a huge subject. I mean, it's very large, and it's beyond the scope of this course, really. Because once you start talking about real property, you start talking about real estate and the value of land and categorization of the value of land, and there's a lot more to it. Most of these issues are legal in nature, not surveying. But as surveyors, we do define the extents of these legal issues. And so without legal descriptions of these extents, we can't give a boundary. So for instance, if I have an owner of a piece of property and they're wanting to sell their property, but they're wanting to know the fair market value. Well, if they've got pine trees on the property, I'm going to have a hard time telling them the fair market value because I don't keep up with what the going cost of pulpwood is. But I can tell them the extents of the pulpwood that they own. So if that makes sense, we really don't define details of legal issues or monetary issues with property, but rather we define the extent at which property can be owned. Okay, and we create these legal descriptions, and this is kind of how we explain boundaries and the extents of those boundaries. So this is a graphical representation of legal description. So I want you to look at this with me for just a minute. First of all, we have title on the outside. Okay, title is the container that holds the bundle of rights that a landowner has. So for instance, when you own land, you have the mineral rights to the land. You have the egress rights. You have the ingress rights. That's coming onto and leaving your land. You have timber rights or rights to the property, the things that are grown on the property, also like agricultural rights. You have water rights, rights to water, and we've talked about those already, where you have water passing through. And then we have surface rights, use of the surface of the land. Okay. Now each right can be conveyed to another entity, person, or by an entity or person that holds title. So for instance, if I want to give somebody the timber rights to my property, I can give them those rights by conveying those rights. And we'll talk about what the word convey means in a moment. But as surveyors, we're not really so much into the conveying so much as we are the extents of the ownership of the title. Where's the timber that I'm giving the rights to company B to gather timber from? What's the extent of the timber rights that I am conveying to timber company B? Okay. To do this, we use a legal description to give rights physical existence. The title is good, the rights are good, but without a boundary and a legal description defining that boundary, it has no physical existence. So this is where the concept of title and the reality of title come together by using a physical or a mathematical boundary. So conveying rights. The process of conveyance, basically conveyance means transferring rights of property to another. So if I'm going to convey something to you, that means I'm going to give you the rights to something. Now typically we convey property in that way. So for instance, in my little example down here at the bottom of the screen, if A conveys the timber rights to B on a 25-acre parcel, then B has the right to harvest the timber on that parcel. But B cannot go beyond the 25 acres. Let's say A has 40 acres. Well, B has only been given the rights for 25 of that 40. They can't go beyond those 25 because those rights have been conveyed from A to B. If rights to property are conveyed, those rights are limited by the titled description. And more than one description may exist for a certain right. I have seen instances where mineral rights, depending on how large the parcel was and the types of minerals that were being gathered at that location, I have seen where that is an issue looking at legal boundaries of where the different types of minerals are and creating a boundary to define the difference and where where you would harvest one thing or the other. Now, when rights are conveyed, they're defined by the limits of a description. For instance, A has title to a 20-acre parcel. If A decides to convey a 5-acre pasture within that 20 acres to B for potato farming, there may need to be two boundary descriptions. For example, one description for the 20 acres, which would be the overall property, and then a 5-acre description for the pasture so that it can be used for potato farming. And typically these rights that are being conveyed will be defined in the conveyance. Now this is usually either made by a lease or made by a quitclaim deed or made by a mineral or rights or a timber deed. I've seen many different types, and depending on where you live in the country, there are other types of deeds. Now descriptions of the boundaries have a deep history in surveying, and they will continue to be the method of describing extents of title and interest. There is not a better way other than describing it based on metes and distances and bounds than what we have currently. And this deep history that we have with it is in everybody's mind. When you talk to somebody about transferring land, they think in those terms. In early history, boundary descriptions were agreed upon by individuals who would walk the perimeter of the parcel. For instance, many times the grantor, or the seller or conveyor, would walk with the grantee, the buyer, around the perimeter of the parcel, and then the agreement would be consummated by the grantor handing the grantee a part of the property, a branch, a rock, or a handful of soil. Now this would just signify the transfer of ownership. So back in the gap, as some of my students would say, if you had Billy Bob, and Billy Bob was selling some land to Joe, well, Billy Bob would walk around the property with Joe, show him where the boundaries are, show him, where the creek ran through and everything. And then when they got finished, he would hand him a handful of dirt from the property and say, now this is yours. And this was a very sacred method of doing that. Nowadays we don't do that. We go down to the courthouse, we sign some paperwork, and it's done. There's no connection to the land anymore like it used to be. Another tradition that we've already talked about in Chapter 1 was called beating the bounds, and you should already be familiar with that. This involved a group of men and boys walking and clearing the boundaries, and each time a boundary corner monument was met, some of the men would hold a boy upside down by his legs and touch his head on the monument. And really, there are stories in your book, but I've read other stories about where the boys, they become old men and they still remember where the boundaries are, because that was such a moment in their lives. Now, I don't know if it was an exciting moment or a fearful moment, but it was a moment nevertheless, and they never forgot that location. Now, when we talk about boundaries, it's important to look at two major categories of boundaries that we will deal with in surveying as long as you are a surveyor. You have micro and macro boundaries. Now, a macro boundary is going to be a boundary that is something that is huge. So we're talking international boundaries, national boundaries, boundaries between states, boundaries between counties, parishes, that kind of thing. Historical land grants, like if we have the Louisiana Purchase, that's a boundary that is a macro boundary. Treaty conveyed lands. In Mississippi, we have 6 different treaties that were created to seize land from the Indians. And so these treaty conveyed lands, the boundary between those is a macro boundary. Major land purchases, once again, like the Louisiana Purchase, and also major land subdivisions. There may be subdivisions between public property, one refuge versus another. Those major land subdivisions, those would be considered macro boundaries. Micro boundaries, on the other hand, are something that we deal with predominantly, which involve township surveys, section surveys, and then we come down to the individual parcel or lot surveys. Now, a local surveyor may come in contact with macro boundaries once or twice in their respective career. You may come into contact with a county boundary more often than a state boundary, and state boundary more often than a national boundary. But it's important to discuss the differences between the creation of both kinds of boundaries, because depending on what kind of boundary is being created, different laws come into play. And so if you think again to the beginning of this chapter where we talked about title, the title doesn't necessarily change, but how we define that title with a boundary changes based on what kind of land that's being surveyed and what kind of boundaries you're dealing with. If one followed the records of a parcel of land, you would find the following information. You would first of all find local information, something that was about municipalities or something that was done just between two individuals that own property. You'll also find information about county boundaries. You'll also find information about state and then country boundaries. And law comes into play at each one of these levels, and sometimes the law is different depending on the level. All of the land that is owned in America today came from a historic land transfer of some kind. Even if we go all the way back to at the end of the Revolutionary War with the Second Treaty of Paris, Great Britain gave us all of the lands east of the Mississippi. So all of that land, even where we live in Mississippi, came from that historic land transfer from Great Britain. Okay? So just a brief look at the history of land transfer and how land was transferred and how Mississippi came to be. Now, some of this is going to be repetitive from the very first lecture, but I thought it might be good to just talk about Mississippi a little bit. Of course, we know in 1492, Christopher Columbus claimed the New World for Spain. He landed somewhere in the Bahamas and started claiming the country. Ponce de Leon was shortly thereafter him and claimed Florida for Spain, and then Hernando de Soto landed at Tampa Bay with orders to conquer Florida for Spain. And so in 1539, the King and Queen of Spain, they said, hey, go over here and conquer Florida for us. Well, he did. And then after conquering Florida in December of 1540, somewhat time in there, he came into Mississippi near where we call modern-day Columbus, Mississippi. He crossed the Tombigbee River. And he explored Mississippi, especially North Mississippi, exclusively for over a year. And then we see in May 5th, 1541, De Soto reached the Mississippi River approximately 30 miles south of modern-day Memphis, Tennessee. And if you go up towards Memphis, you will see some signs about De Soto. You'll see places where people think he went. If you read about the history of De Soto, some of that is disputed on where he actually went. But from what information I can find that is true and valid, this is actual. Now, from 1542, basically the end of De Soto's searching in Mississippi, to 1762, the region covered by Mississippi changed hands from the French and the Spanish and back again as both governments colonized the region. Now, the reason that they were doing this is because neither government was really fond of the English. In 1733, Georgia became an English colony. And what they did was they said, all right, here's Georgia, but we're going to go all the way to the Mississippi River with it. Well, there were people that already lived in the Mississippi Territory at that time that were French and Spanish. And so the British just thought they owned everything, and they went out after it and said, well, this is ours. And they tried to actually kick the Spanish and the French out of the region. Well, it didn't work out so well. There were many conflicts, and including conflicts with the Indians, caused a lot of drama. Well, in 1752, Georgia was surrendered to the King of England. So basically, they started out as just an English colony. They were going to govern themselves, but in 1752, it was surrendered to the King of England and became part of the 13 colonies that were owned by the king. Well, between that time, I know there's a little gap there, 1752 and 1754 started the French and Indian War. Excuse me. And at the end of the French and Indian War, in February 16th of 1763, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and all of the land that was owned by the French and the Spanish at the time was given to the English, and the English made a big deal out of it. The king was very arrogant about it. On October the 7th, 1763, Royal Proclamation declared the East and West Florida region to be created south of the 31st parallel. So they basically split it up by Royal Proclamation shortly after the Treaty of Paris. And then in 1764, West Florida was extended to include that farmland south of the Yazoo River. Now, if you'll remember from the slides from Chapter 1, this was a line that was drawn approximately north 32 degrees, 28 minutes latitude as the new northern boundary of West Florida. But this was disputed for many years because this was done by a king arbitrarily. And then when the colonists got a hold of the land, the English colonists, we started to see where America was moving in that direction, and the French didn't like it, and the Spanish didn't like it, and so we had some issues with that. Of course, on July 4th, 1766, we declared our independence from England, and on September the 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and all of the land that, the second Treaty of Paris, by the way, and all of that land that was owned by the English was now ceded to the 13 colonies. So America is now starting to grow because of this. Now, there were some people in Georgia that wanted to cause some problems. See, we tried to sell land immediately. Notice that was only 2 years later. And we tried to sell land so that we could pay off some debt. Well, Georgia wanted to pay off their debt by selling a large portion of the Mississippi Territory and calling it the County of Bourbon. Now, not after the whiskey, but just after a group of people. This declared that lands previously called West Florida were now a county of Georgia. However, this was inhabited by Spanish, and they weren't real pleased about being told that they were now part of an English or an American colony, and they were going to be called the County of Bourbon. So Georgia was hard-pressed to govern this because it stretched Georgia out. You think where Georgia is today, coming all the way to the Mississippi River and telling some people what to do in a day when we don't have interstate highways and mass transit, it was very difficult to govern, and this failed miserably. There were other attempts between 1785 and 1796 to sell large pieces of land. One of these was the Yazoo Company tried to buy a large portion of Mississippi and call it the state of Yazoo. Didn't work out real well for them. And these all happened between 1785 and 1796. Most of these ventures failed miserably because of their unethical measures taken by Georgia legislature members. There's stories that I've read in several textbooks and several history books where the deeds would be signed and dated and everybody be happy until the local people found out, and then the government would have to burn these deeds in public forum. I think it was really interesting how all that happened. In 1795, the Treaty of San Lorenzo El Real stated the boundary between the U.S. and the Spanish-owned lands was to be the 31st parallel. And this was a very big move because remember that Yazoo River mess from the 32 degrees 28 minutes down to the 31st parallel was no man's land. No one really knew what was owned. But now this boundary was created, and it is the modern-day boundary between Mississippi and Louisiana. And then we come to Andrew Ellicott. In May 21st of 1796, the United States Senate appointed Andrew Ellicott, an astronomer, and Thomas Freeman, a surveyor, to define the location of the 31st parallel. And this was the first boundary, the first macro boundary of Mississippi. And this was created by setting Ellicott Stone in just north of Mobile Bay in Alabama. And all this information was obtained from Rafi Burt's book, The Survey of Mississippi State, Indian, and Township Boundaries. Now, looking at the macro boundaries of Mississippi, in 1817, these were the macro boundaries of Mississippi. But in 1817, we didn't own all the land of Mississippi. In fact, the land that Newton County sits in right now, and most of where all of you are from, was still owned by the Choctaws and the Chickasaws. Well, that didn't matter much to the government. They still wanted to form a state and call the state Mississippi, and so these were the boundaries. Notice that we started at the Tennessee River, down to the mouth of Bear Creek, to the northwest corner of Washington County, Alabama, which is also the northeast corner of Wayne County, Mississippi, down to the Gulf of Mexico at a funky angle. Notice that difference in angle. The story is that two surveyors came out, one from Bear Creek and one from the Gulf of Mexico, and they met there at the corner of Washington County, and they called it good. They were both trying to draw a line straight south. North and south didn't work out so well. Bounded by the Gulf of Mexico then to the Pearl River, up the Pearl River to the 31st parallel, and then to the Mississippi River all the way back up to the then boundary of Tennessee. And this was the macro boundaries of 1817. Now, the old Natchez and the old Tombigbee districts are the oldest settled portions of modern-day Mississippi. Many maps show that this is the area around where Natchez is, and the Tombigbee districts were South Mississippi. Much of the land in Forest, Wayne, Jasper counties, that kind of area. Some down in Lawrence County. A little bit down towards Greene County, but we're getting a little farther south there. All of that was in the old Tombigbee district, and it's the oldest settled portion of modern-day Mississippi. If you look at John Mellish's 1819 map of Mississippi, you can look it up on Google. That map of Mississippi actually shows the boundaries as they were set in 1817 for these districts. But then we had other purchases. We had the Choctaw Purchases of 1805. Excuse me. We had the Spanish Acquisition of 1812. Remember we had a War of 1812? Yeah, that's what we got out of it. We had the Chickasaw Purchase of 1816. That's much of North Mississippi. The West Mississippi. West Mississippi. Choctaw Purchase of 1820. This is where most of us live now. The Newton County, Hinds County, Scott, Lauderdale, Leake County, all that was in 1820. 1830 is the northern portion up towards Starkville and Choctaw County and Atala County. And then in 1832 we have the Chickasaw Purchase, which finished North Mississippi off and completed the purchases that would fill in the Mississippi Territory and make us completely a state. Now, in 1798, the Mississippi Territory was created, but survey lines had been established through treaties of Choctaw and Chickasaw nations. But these lines were based on metes and bounds descriptions and based on just agreements. Some of this was just, okay, you stop here at this creek and that's where we're going to call the line. But this wasn't a good method of measuring land. We knew this at the time, but that's the way that the Indians defined their land. And something important to note here is Indians believed that you couldn't own land. The Native Americans were very focused on being a part of the land, but giving back to the land. And one cannot own something that they consider themselves to be a part of. And so this idea of owning land was foreign to them, and they really didn't understand it. In March 3rd of 1803, Congress passed an act to survey the lands south of Tennessee, and this survey would be conducted with a new rectangular survey system, or the PLSS. Excuse me, I got the coughs tonight. So we're going to talk about two methods of boundary creation and the combination of their use. Methods of boundary creation. On metes and bounds mean measuring distance and defining a monument of some kind or a boundary. These surveys are based off those measurements and boundaries. The selection of bounds and the units of method determining metes could cause serious issues with the retracement of these surveys, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. The public land survey system organizes the surveys are based off of a grid system of townships and sections. We've talked about that a little bit before. We've discussed it at length, and we'll actually discuss it more when we get into a later chapter about sectionalized lands. But to give you an idea about our modern descriptions today, we use a little bit of both. We use a combination of the two. We'll use a description starting with a point of commencement, a POC, that is always a corner, a section corner, a township corner, a quarter section corner, defined by the PLSS, but then we'll come and make a metes and bounds description from that. Reasoning behind that is it's easier to define the location to start from and then have a metes and bounds based off of good distances and good monumentation, and use a combination of the two. And almost all of the surveys that you will see in Mississippi or conduct will be a combination of the two. Remember, any of the PLSS states, we have to start at an original corner. An original survey has to be investigated and started at that survey so that we can create a new boundary, a retracement. So, kind of an example, if you use just the PLSS, the west half of the southwest quarter of Section 25, Township 4 North, Range 12 East. This shaded description, this hatched area on Section 25 here is defining that piece of land. Well, this is easily understood. I can look at this and divide it into quarters and halves and all such as that. But not all the sections are equal in area. If I look at this, I would say, well, that's supposed to be 80 acres. But I don't know that it's supposed to be 80 acres. Also, some of the other problems with the description is, how do I define where the lines are on the ground? Notice there's no distances given. So that distance is where my monumentation. So PLSS is good to give a description, good to define something, but it's very difficult to define actual ownership and actual lengths of lines. But with the same token, if we used metes and bounds only, it can be even more confusing. Read this. Starting at the old fence corner, which, yeah, we all know where that is, thence east 204 feet to the small creek, thence following the creek southwesterly until you reach Mr. Smith's open field. At that point, then you make a run west to reach the Dirks Road, and thence follow the road until you arrive at the old fence corner. First of all, we don't know where the old fence corner is. We're really not sure who Mr. Smith is, and do we know that the creek hasn't moved? Yeah, so there's some problems with this description as well. A good description will contain some of both. Now, I did not post this at the time. I will come back and post this, but I would like y'all to look at the description examples file from the lecture slides handout. And basically, it's a piece of property that my parents own, my grandfather, in fact. And it starts out at the northwest corner of the southwest quarter of the northeast quarter of section 15. Well, then it has a meets and bounds description from there to define the shaded piece of property. And you'll notice there's a lot of clarity in the description because it takes the best of both worlds and puts them together. This is the way that we do a survey today, and this is the way you will define a legal description of a boundary. So why? So we can understand title and the extent of that title. That's all for the first half of Chapter 3, where we talked about ownership, transfer, and description of real property. Part 2, you can watch that next. We'll talk more about the legal side of things and get a little bit more into the textbook. Hope you've enjoyed this lecture. I hope it's been something good to you, and hope to hear from you soon.